I'm Lauren Myers, Associate Editor of Monograph Matters for the Society for Research in Child Development. Today, I'll be talking to Dana Townsend and Mark Cummings, authors of a recent issue of the Monographs for the Society for Research in Child Development. Their co-authors are Laura Taylor, Christine Marylees, Andrea Fury, Marcy Goki-Mori, and Peter Sherlow. The work is titled Youth in Northern Ireland, Linking Violence Exposure, Emotional Insecurity, and the Political Macrosystem. You can visit monographmatters.srcd.org for videos, commentaries, teaching materials, and additional content related to this work. I'll start by asking Mark, how did you become initially interested in studying youth in Ireland during the Troubles?
Well, it's an interesting story, I think. When I first came to Notre Dame, I've been studying conflict and violence in families and the impact on children for many years. So I was asked, because of that interest, to become a fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies because of my interest in conflict and violence. But having been a member, going to fellows meetings several times a semester, I observed that although there are many fellows, none of them were studying impact of conflict and violence, the point of view of children and families, that the concern was primarily political, a political science type perspective. So I raised the issue as an important one to understanding the full impact of political violence on society, both from the point of view of really the peace process. If studying political violence is only the level of politics, does it really reach the people? Does it make a difference for the people, the families and children and communities? And also, point of view of understanding the impact of political violence on society. So after raising this question a few times in fellows meetings, the director of the center asked me to come to lunch, and we talked about how I could perhaps work in Northern Ireland, where we had some connections, to try to expand the study of peace process and understanding of violence to children and families. Actually, it was kind of a long story after that. I went over several times. We had several initiatives that didn't pan out. But finally, there was a meeting at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame where they invited Ed Cairns, who's a distinguished researcher studying impact of the Troubles, which is the term used for political violence in Northern Ireland on children and families. And we talked at dinner, and he said, maybe we should sometime try to start a study. I said, that sounds good. A few months later, he said, I'm going to SRCD, so we have breakfast and talk about this. So at SRCD, we had breakfast, we talked about the possibilities. And then I ran into some colleagues later that day that said there was a new call for an RFA to study violence in children. And I learned that it included international studies of violence in children. So I came back to Ed at SRCD meeting, and we decided to write a grant proposal, which we did. And the first round of review was not funded. The second round it was, and that's how we got started. But it really was a concern with a broader understanding of the impact of political violence on society, not beyond just at the political level, peace process at the level of community and families and children. The idea being that would be essential to a lasting peace process, understanding that level, also to a broader understanding of the implications. And furthermore, I was interested in bringing the study of impact of violence and conflict on children outside of the family, the broader macro system. So I wanted to expand this work, which I thought would be relevant to any understanding of how violence affects society outside of the family to a broader model. So at the very beginning, we're interested in the social ecological model, like a Bronfenbrenner type model for advancing this theoretical and practical implications of this work.
Interesting. So many important studies in our field, I think, have been hatched over breakfast or coffee or meals at SRCD or other conferences. So that's neat that that's part of the origin story. Turning to Dana, you added a really unique spin on this study by looking at newspapers to assess the macrosystem in the study. Why was newspaper coding a particularly valuable option in this case?
Okay, so it's a good question actually about why we use newspapers, because most of the attempts to measure the macrosystem in the past have really relied on surveys, because that's where psychologists tend to be most comfortable working. So it tended to ask individuals about what was happening in the macrosystem, and then to aggregate it across a large sample. And the research team really decided, okay, that's not exactly a macrosystem assessment. That's an aggregation of micro-level assessments, and they're different. So this required a lot more engagement with the kind of methods used in other disciplines. So we looked a lot into sociologists and sociology and political science, and tried to understand what kind of methods do they use, and is there anything that could be valuable for our research in terms of measuring the macrosystem. And we chose newspapers for a number of reasons. I would say one of them is that many of the macro level, the systems level macro data sets that are available, they tend to focus on the nation state. So you can look at the macro system in the United Kingdom, you can look at it in Ireland, but you can't focus specifically on a region. And newspapers allow you to do that. It allows you to zoom in on that context and really look at whatever region it is you're interested in by looking at the local newspapers. It's also valuable because the indicators that are used for many of the data sets tend to focus on violence, on overt violence. So many of them, the Correlates of War Project is one that I'm thinking of, that's a data set. And it looks at violence in terms of battle-related deaths. So it's really focusing on this high-level violence. And that's really not what we're looking at in Northern Ireland, these kind of post-accord contexts where you're really focused on conflict transformation. It's not that high-intensity violence or war. It's really at a place where it's a more low-level conflict. So newspapers are great because they do include violence. It includes crime. It includes nonviolent things that are happening, such as disputes regarding legislation and different anniversaries about major events. It includes, protests and rioting, and positive changes as well. So it allows you to really understand the context in a more broad way than many of the data sets would.
That's really interesting. And it sounds like you really used inspiration from other fields and really went into this with a very open mind about how you were going to do this methodology.
We did. We tried to. We really tried to be open and to explore the kind of data sets and it was really outside of our comfort zone, I should say, as a research team. And some of the co-authors were really involved in this process as well. I would say Tina Merrilees and Laura Taylor, they really did a lot of work in researching the different methods that are out there.
From the very beginning, we were interested in a social ecological model for understanding the impact of political violence and armed conflict on children, but there are no satisfactory approaches from our perspectives or the perspectives conceptually of Bronfenbrenner's model for studying the macro system. So like I said earlier, we started out with, as a fellow of the Kroc Institute, much of the concern was the level of political level, or religious level, and so forth, a broader level, but not the more microsystem level or the individual level. But the approaches that have been trying to capture the macro system were not satisfactory. Like Dana said, they're more like asking individuals what they thought about the macro system. So we had to find a way to capture the macro system in a way that'd be sensitive to the particular social ecology of Northern Ireland, and or the case anywhere, be sensitive to the particular social ecology, without asking individuals to report on it, but finding another way that would be conceptually and empirically satisfactory, which is how we came up with the newspaper coding idea.
Back to Dana, what are some of the challenges of incorporating the macro system into developmental research?
So there are many. It's hard to know where to begin. So there are many challenges conceptually, methodologically, statistically, and I think that each step of those was a process in this study. So conceptually, there's not that much agreement or understanding about what the macro system is, from a psychological perspective. And I think, is it national policy? Is it culture? When we're talking about the macro system, what are we talking about, and how does it differentiate from the exosystem? And I think that Bronfenbrenner did a really great job of describing it in his work. Although when you talk about the microsystem, there's a very clear process that he outlines about how the microsystem affects individuals and how the exosystem affects individuals. And the macrosystem just doesn't have that same level of conceptual clarity. So there was a lot of difficulty understanding, like, okay, not only what is it, but how would this potentially affect individuals and what are the processes there? There were also challenges methodologically, which we've already said about, you know, how do you measure it? And especially considering that the macrosystem it's less tangible than the other levels. It's not as concrete. So you're talking about norms and narratives, ideologies, you know, how do you measure that? How do you incorporate that into a study? That was another reason why the newspapers were helpful, because it's a way to get at that climate, that political climate. And I think many measures, the indicators they use, don't really tap into that more intangible level. So that was a challenge as well. And then statistically, you know, when you're doing anything for multi-level modeling, for example, or any study, there has to be some kind of variation that allows you to compare between groups. So when you're looking at the microsystem in our study, you can compare between Catholics and Protestants or between levels of exposure to violence. When you're looking at the exosystem, you can compare between access to resources or levels of crime in the neighborhood. But theoretically, the macrosystem is the same for everyone in a context. So there's no variation there. So how do you compare when everyone, again, theoretically, is experiencing the same macrosystem? And that was a major challenge that really held up, I think, a lot of moving forward on this project. It was a difficult question to answer that and figure out a study that allowed us to create variation where there was none. So that all three of them, it's not easy to incorporate this level for psychologists, and I don't know that we did it perfectly, but we did it the best way that we were able to do.
Thank you to Dana Townsend and Mark Cummings for joining me today to talk about their work. As a reminder, the work is titled Youth in Northern Ireland, Linking Violence Exposure, Emotional Insecurity, and the Political Macrosystem. You can visit monographmatters.srcd.org for videos, commentaries, teaching materials, and additional content related to this work. Thank you.